the cost of certain technology is coming down in general. So maybe where you might have historically built it because you thought you could build it cheaper, that may no longer be an argument.
Welcome to another episode of Tax Leaders Unplugged. Our guest today is Sara Mendiola. And Sara is US based and she's currently the tax technology manager at LyondellBasell, which is a Fortune 500 chemical company. And before, Sara had roles at Spectra Energy, at Southern Union Company, and HP in different types of roles. And she started her career at KPMG. Today, we will be discussing how to take the right tax technology strategy and compare buy versus build and anything in between. Hi, Sara.
Good morning, Stevie. How are you?
Yeah, good. What about yourself? Welcome to the podcast.
Doing okay. I'm very happy to be here.
Absolutely. Tell us a bit, Sara, about other than tax drives you in life, what energizes you, and what brought you into the tax scene.
So I'm a mom of three. I spend a lot of time with my family. I am a self-proclaimed gym rat. I work out multiple times a week. It's where I reset, recharge, get my stress relief, and it's also my social hour. I ended up in tax. This is a somewhat interesting story. My intermediate accounting professor actually asked me if I had ever considered tax, and he's how I ended up with my first job. So originally I was going to do international business, and so I never designed tax, but that's where my entire career and profession has been since then. It's interesting because now I don't know what else I would do besides this, and I really truly enjoy what I do, and I think that being in the technology transformation space to me is creative. So a lot of people, when you tell them I'm a certified public accountant by trade, and they're like, oh, that sounds boring, spreadsheets. And I'm like, oh, yes, I love Excel. But what I do now is really creative and innovative, and it's not numbers and forms, it's solving problems and doing things innovative and thinking outside of the box. So I really, truly enjoy what I do now.
And how did you evolve into the tax technology side of things? Did you start your career in technology, or did you start more traditionally and then evolved organically into it?
Definitely more traditionally. I did the more traditional tax work, provision, compliance, planning, all of that. And I think that anybody in the profession just knows that as you went along, technology just became a more integrated and important part of that journey. We're always asked to do more with less. The legislation is always moving. Digitalization, just in general. I don't know, we're on like the fourth or fifth industrial revolution, those kinds of things just not in the way. And so if you show maybe desire or aptitude in that space, you're often ending up wearing two hats. And so thankfully I was blessed to find an organization that prioritized and saw the value in technology and even process improvements. And so we've always had a dedicated team. So that's something that I do appreciate. I know that Lyondell isn't necessarily Google. We're not the cutting edge software company, but they've always seen the value in having my function.
Great. And I already love to hear that you start with also referring to the importance of process and then maybe after that or in parallel to that, technology. Explain a bit to the audience what your view is on the importance of processes and how you deal with it in your organization. Is there a specific team looking after
Yes.
processes?
So this is an interesting journey. I've been at Lyondell almost 7 years. And again, this function existed before I got here. But I do think the role of tax technology has changed over time. It's no longer just system implementation. I think that's where it was born to start. We do system administration, but now we also do a lot of custom development. And my team in particular, we have a process excellence arm. So that's been around maybe within the last year or so, where we just really recognized the process was critical to anything that we were doing. This is not my phrase, but it was one of my favorite phrases. We did not want to do garbage at the speed of light. So if you don't fix the process, then you're just doing a bad process faster when you automate it. So we really took a step back and said, what are we doing? How are we doing it? Who are we doing? Like, where are we getting the data? Does it even make sense what we're doing? before we try to put an automation on top of it. We have a whole team called Process Excellence that, depending on what the project is, what the ask is, what the business outcome, what we're trying to achieve, it may start with them before it comes to me to do any kind of automation. But we definitely work hand in hand for most of our work streams.
And is the process excellence team, is that a part of the tax team, or is it just sitting outside of tax, supporting all of the different departments in the organization?
It's part of what we call our tax excellence team. So I'm one arm and the process is the other. So I'm the technology arm and then we have a process arm, and we all sit under the tax umbrella.
All right. And maybe a last question on the topic, like what is a typical background of a process excellence team member?
Oh, okay. So we call that the purple squirrel because they're hard to find. So oftentimes they're either finding a tax professional, kind of like me, that did the normal traditional work and that found they had an aptitude, a desire, a curiosity in the technology or process space. Or you might even find someone that's like a data scientist. I would say we're a mixed bag. It probably makes the most sense to just be diverse and have the different skill sets and the different viewpoints. But you don't have to only be tax, and you don't have to only be, let's say, management information systems or computer information systems. We really feel like we work on everyone's strengths if you can have a mixture of all.
Yeah, very inspiring, I think, for a lot of companies out there that don't have such a dedicated team supporting the tax function with the focus on process excellence.
We
And
are always busy.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And something which we always push forward because we are in the firefighting zone and we don't have the time to reflect on it. But yeah, great to hear that you have a dedicated support function for that. Sara, to go to the topic for today, buy versus build, and picking your tax technology brains on that topic. Tell us a bit, like, typically you have a specific need, you have a problem, you have a desire in your organization to implement one or the other technology. Assume that we have identified the need and the problem that we want to solve. The first question, or the question for today, buy versus build. Where do we get started? How do we even get started on that analysis? What is your first view on that?
It is definitely a fundamental question. It's something that we oftentimes start with. We need to hurdle that before we can get going, because it is, if you're buying versus you're building, it's a whole different can of worms depending on which way you go. And it is something that, at least at our organization, we try and ask at the very onset of any projects. And there's a lot of things to consider in that question. A lot of times it's skill set. Resources are huge. Like, everyone knows that you have finite resources, both in a technical space. It is funding, right? You have to have budget or dollars. I think even if you have resources, do your resources have the correct skill sets? And I think that we're all trying to, again, do less with more and being innovative in our approach to this. So I think we have to think outside the box. But normally, from a project management perspective, if we have a project that's been, let's say, approved, it's being stood at, that buy versus build is our first milestone that we have to go through. And normally you have to make sure you have all of the correct stakeholders at the table. So it may not just be the project team itself that needs to be involved, but anybody else within finance, within IT, within tax. There's other groups that may care about the decision that you have to include in that discussion. And then we start the analysis, market analysis, resource evaluation, project scope. All of those play into the overall decision.
And let's maybe take a very concrete example. Do you have an example of a project that you recently worked on that you're willing to share here in the tax technology space that we can take as an example, which we use throughout the conversation?
And I'm working on right now, a lot of jurisdictions have what they call a standard audit file for tax. They have different ones, right? It's usually their starting point for an audit. It is digital. In the US, the IRS uses what they call a DART file. In this particular instance, we were working on something for France, where you have to provide a lot of very granular detail that ties to your overall trial balance and your financial statements. And they use it for all audits. So not necessarily a tax audit, it could be a social audit. So it's just their starting place.
Yeah.
And We have gone back and forth on the best approach for this, and we're actually still in the midst of making those decisions. But a lesson learned was making sure all of the teams that needed to be impact or needed to be included in the decision making were brought to the table. And so what I mean is this is normally a function that the ultimate ownership ends with tax. The word tax is in the name of the file, but it's not really tax data, right? It's trial balance data. There may be a tax account in there, but we don't own the entire trial balance. Is originally when we tried to start working on this project, we were like, oh, we're gonna do this. It's gonna be great. But we didn't bring the accounting side or our chief accounting group along with the journey. And so they were like, wait, what's going on? So I think that was a big lesson learned. Like they need to be involved in the build versus buy, not just tax, right? Because they are at the very minimum giving us the data that maybe they could be an operator, but maybe not want to be an operator. And so then that's another consideration in that build versus buy.
Yeah. So you start with identifying the different stakeholders that are involved in one way or another. You are maybe the bigger beneficial of the results, the outcome when the technology is implemented. But all the other stakeholders, you try to map them out. You need to have them at the table. Maybe a first question that pops up there. How do you motivate those stakeholders to be at the table if for them it's not a priority? Because maybe to what you're saying, it's a tax job that will be solved. It's your problem. Maybe I'm the data owner and I'm involved from the sidelines, but how do you motivate them to be at the table nevertheless? Any experience there? Is there typically pushback or?
I'm definitely smiling because you're asking all the perfect, correct, golden questions here, Stevie. For sure, it is sometimes a challenge to motivate them and what we've carrot versus stick, like, well, how are they going to benefit or what pain or maybe they can experience and or share with us if we can't work together to make this decision and move forward in the project. Honestly, that's usually what I like to say more bees with honey. Like, how am I going to make your life better? How do I make your employee experience better? Your day-to-day job better? That's what I like to focus on. But I think it also just shows them like, okay, here's the pain that if we don't make a decision and go forward with this project that we're all going to experience.
And do you want an executive sponsor or somebody that is high up in the organization that can be maybe the stick also towards stakeholders that are not beginning, or how do you deal with that?
I don't think that I would make any first soul have to be the stick per se. Usually that's the legislation or the taxing authority. Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, normally in our project structure, we do require an executive sponsor. In this example, it's probably still tax because from a RACI perspective, we are still accountable for this requirement. But depending on what the project was, you might have a joint sponsorship between tax and finance or tax and accounting or whatever the nature of the request.
We have here our problem that we want to solve, the audit file and the, let's say, improvement technology-wise, how to get such an audit file in France or in different countries. You have your stakeholders identified, you have your right colleagues at the table. So then we come to what are we going to do? Are we going to buy something off the shelves? Are we going to build? What are the next steps there in the analysis?
So normally it's pros and cons. So if you can boil it down to a couple options that fit for your organization, like it may be something where you say, I never am going to outsource a build, even though that can be an option, right? So you could build in-house, you could outsource the build, you could engage a consultant to do the work for you. You could do the work in-house. You could do a hybrid structure where maybe you have a shared service center and they could do some of the processing and then you pull the review back over. So there's lots of different options that you go through. So I think if you can at least lay out those options where you can visually see them. And then what we normally try and do is what categories do we need to look at that you can judge across them for budget. It's going to be an easy one, right? Like how many dollars, or if there's no dollars, resources is another one. Level of expertise, level of control, speed to solution. All of those are things that you might gauge across the different options, kind of pros and cons. And again, being a CPA by trade, I like to do that so you can do a rating or a ranking and come up with a formal answer of where all of them sit. But I
Yeah.
think you also have to consider some of those non-quantitative analysis to make your final decision for sure.
Yeah. And because you come from a Fortune 500 organization, a large multinational, you probably have some experience with build. What are in your mind, or like based on your experience, the biggest pros when you compare a build versus buy, irrespective of the specific job that we want to solve? But give us some examples of what very clear pros are for a build.
For a build, you're in the driver's seat.
Mhm.
You can make it bespoke, right? You can make it exactly as you need. You can fit your exact back circumstances, your data, because a lot of times you're going to have data or processes concerns earlier to our previous conversation that you have to solve or accommodate for. And so a build is going to be more flexible in allowing you to accommodate those things. From an enhancement cycle, if you just think about product development or solution development and solution design, you get to say what you're going to enhance when. A lot of times, if you buy something off the shelf, you are not owning that roadmap, right? So it has to be maybe you have come across something that you really need and you wish this tool did, but if not, the rest of, like, say, the client population has that same requirement or desire, you may be low on the totem pole or far out on the roadmap, and that vendor may never get to it. And so it may be something that you really need. I think from an enhancement cycle, from a design of just features, functionalities, security, if you have that kind of concern of your organization, you are more in control of that in a build.
Yep.
There's another side to that coin though, right? So
Mhm.
the downside to that is that you have to support it. You don't have a help desk. You don't have a ticket system. You are on the hook for any break fixes. You're on the hook for any upgrades, any software, any patching, all of that you're going to own in-house. And that in it itself is a, let's say, cost of ownership that you're going to need to handle. But also something that we have found in solutions that we've built is you may have an amazing project team and you are rocking and rolling and you make the best solution ever. And then we move on, right? They go on to bigger, better things. Maybe they leave the organization and some of that knowledge can be lost. And then it can be really hard to maintain and support that solution. And another thing is documentation is key. Document the documentation because you're going to forget what you did, why you did, what design decision you made. And so I think that's another thing that you have to think about when you are building in-house is making sure that your documentation is on point.
Yeah, because that brings us indeed to the probably key person risk, where, to your point, specific important stakeholders that help to build it leave the organization, move on to other projects, other roles. And if then it's not properly documented, it's very difficult to maintain and further enhance the solution, right?
Mm-hmm. And if there are some, what we call like critical decision points, like I could have done A or B, but I picked A and no one remembers why, that's a problem.
Yeah. You dropped, so documenting it, but maybe a step back, the calculation of the total cost of ownership. Do you have like
Mm-hmm.
templates for that? What are the specific components that's for both options, buy versus build, and the TCO then?
So I definitely think the total cost of ownership goes into that equation of buy versus build. I don't know if I have a formula per se that we generally use, but you definitely need to consider things, the easy stuff like licensing. They normally, most vendors are going to put some kind of annual mark percentage increase every year. Support. Sometimes you can buy an application, and although you get the normal support, it may not be sufficient for your needs. So sometimes you'll buy extra support packages or direct support packages. So that's what you have to think about. And also, like your architecture, are you going to have to make any advancements on your own landscape in order to continue to use the tools? So things that I have experienced is maybe we purchase something on premise, which I know a lot of people don't do anymore, but a couple years ago, IT was still scared of the cloud. And so maybe you purchase something on premise and now you are trying to upgrade it and move forward, and they only offer SaaS. And usually that's not just an easy lift and shift. It's another implementation. So
Mm.
those are things you have to think about as technology is moving. vendors are moving. What could this mean in the future? And what other implementation fees, support fees could be included, things that maybe you have to do internally in order to facilitate that application. All of those have to be considered for sure.
And if I were the CFO, then typically I would indeed look at the TCO, the total cost of ownership, but any other, let's say, drivers that you would include in the business case and the ROI analysis that you can think of, and also how the differences potentially are between buy versus build. Any experience there?
I think I was very much piling on the costs and things you have to consider in total cost of ownership, but there are maybe some things that help bring that down. If you are replacing one tool, where maybe there was 3 that used to do something like that, that's something that we consider. Are you replacing or reducing our overall footprint or landscape by getting this one tool? We also look at employee and customer experience when we're deciding what to do with a project. Is this going to help our customers or operations? Is this going to help our employees? It's a little bit of a harder thing to quantify. It is a more qualitative measure, but we do think that is important. And time spent is another thing that we look at with the build and the buy. How long is this going to take to build? If we buy it off the shelf, how long does it take to implement? Like maybe that is critical. Oftentimes in the tax landscape, you're getting a new law or legislation and you may not have a lot of lead time. So it may be that you have to be compliant by a certain enacted date, and we don't think that we can build it fast enough. So you might list as a big one, which I hadn't thought of until the second, but something in particular for tax is that the target's always moving, right? And so a vendor-owned solution, besides giving you the help desk and the support, a lot of times they're also going to provide you with that tax, let's say, knowledge or expertise. So they're going to keep track of what rate in what jurisdiction, or if this is deductible or if that's deductible. And so that's another thing that you could consider, because you may not, as an owner, want to have to stay on top of rules and legislation globally, where if you buy a vendor managed tool, they normally supply that in the software package.
Yeah. If we think back about the build option, so somebody needs to build it internally then. Is this typically resources that you have in the tax team? Is this part of the IT team that will support you? If it is the latter, if it is the IT team that is supporting you, how do you also then ensure that it's done in a timely fashion, knowing that typically IT is always swamped and tax is maybe not their biggest priority? What are your experiences there? Who is building it, and what does it take to have it prioritized if it is internally built by another than the tax team?
It depends what we're trying to do. Our tax excellence team will try and work as independent as possible, because we don't like to be on another team's schedule, right? And then we have greater control of resources and timing and scheduling. So it depends on what we're trying to do. If it is a larger list, or if it's something that gets outside of like the citizen development tools or stack, then IT has to be involved. That's just our governance, right? And then there is an analysis of resources. Do we have enough resources in-house? Does it make sense to maybe go find some contractors, even for IT, to do this tax project? Oftentimes, we tend to prefer to have, if there is a third party, somebody that has tax expertise. We're not going to want just like a software developer to come in and build something for us. We're going to want someone that either works in that space, any of the accounting firms that maybe have a technology arm, because we really want to lean on them for best practice and to help us make those design decisions from both a tax technical perspective, but also the IT technical design build perspective, because all of that matters.
Yeah. All right. No, that's clear. Do you have examples where it was super clear that it should have been a build or a buy, and then the reasons why? Like examples where the analysis, like from the very first minute, indicated buy versus build, just to maybe find parameters, criteria where if you come across them, you immediately need to opt for buy versus build. Do you have any of those examples?
It may be a little bit generic, but I think that if you have data issues, if you have system concerns, so if you think about a buy, Normally, hopefully that's as off the shelf as possible. But if you cannot provide the inputs for it to work off the shelf, you're essentially building, right? If you have to take something that you can buy and customizing it, you're building it. So why are you buying it, right? You might still consider building it because you're going to have to customize it so much that you really didn't buy it anymore. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's something to consider is your
It-
processes and your data for sure.
yeah, it's a good one. Like data wise, I understand you want to capture, manipulate the data that you are working with. So the tool that you are buying should be able to handle that. But if you reflect on processes, could it also be that changing the process so that the tool that you are looking at should not be customized? Can that also be maybe a better fix for the problem you're having?
So going back to the France, uh, ideally, if we had everything in one system in place, then it would be simpler. And unfortunately, our facts and circumstances is that we're using more than one system. And so that kind of, I think, made it hard to say we're just going to buy something because we don't have a standard process, right? And we don't have the same system. And so then that begs the question is, hey, can we solve that upstream first? Because that's going to make any automation better. And we're still having those discussions. But again, it's hard because it is not fully tax owned processes and systems and data. And it makes those conversations challenging for sure.
Yep. Did you experience already any differences when it comes to change management and implementing a solution, buy versus build? Is there change management wise less resistance from the stakeholders to adopt a new way of working or adopt a new tool when it is buy versus build? Any experience there, or is it depending on the case?
I think that's an interesting question because I think most end users are not involved in either the build or the implementation of the buy, right? So there's always change management no matter which way you go. I do think though, from maybe if you just say within a project team, the build, maybe people understand understand why things are done a certain way and that they may buy in a little bit better than getting something off the shelf where they're just trying to like check boxes or plug in different things. I think change management from an end user adoption is always challenging and something that we're working on no matter what we're doing. And the change management even can be from a process perspective. It can do and doesn't even have to deal with the tool, whether it's bought or built. It's usually the change management on the process side that you have to get folks comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about the way of working, which then might be impacted because of the fact that a new tool is part of the new process, right?
And something that we don't want to happen, but often can, is if you don't focus on the change management and you're trying to give the team a tool to make their life better, but they don't trust, let's say, or don't feel comfortable, and then they're actually doubling their work. 'Cause maybe they're using the tool, but then they're still doing their old process to validate the tool. And so then they're just duplicated what they used to be doing. So I think obviously communication is critical. Actual change management strategies are critical. And some of our large implementations, this one I'm thinking about was a build. We engaged our Office of Change Management. So we actually have an Office of Change Management internally at LyondellBasell. And they helped me think through the communication plan, the touch points, the timings, what we're going to tell people, when we're going to tell them, what they need to know, what is going to be easily consumable to get them ready for the go live, let's say.
What are the golden change management nuggets that you learned from that team, which you want to share with the tax audience? Management tips and tricks?
I do think a communication plan is key. It may seem odd and maybe untyping, but like actually saying, okay, here's our project timeline, right? And then you layer on a communication plan on top of that. And who is my audience? And what is maybe the best media? Maybe it's a meme that will really resonate with them. I found I want to do one page kind of infographics, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just a bunch of words because people get tons of emails all the time. And that's the other thing to think about. Does an email make sense? Do you want it at the start of a meeting? Does a small little YouTube clip that they can watch and come back and look at later make sense? So I think the media or the medium with which you do the communication is also critical to think through. The message I have found, even though I am fairly verbose and naturally, that less is more. How can I concisely communicate this
Mhm.
in terms that everyone will understand and make sure that my message comes across? So I always have to say, what are my key takeaways? If I was sitting in their seat, what do I really need to know to understand what's happening and what do I care about? And sometimes you may need to tailor that communication plan based on your audience. Your VP, your leadership is not going to necessarily want to know the same thing that your staff accountant would want to know.
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. How do you deal with next generation technologies and the potential benefit or opportunities they can bring for your organization? The biggest one we all have on top of mind, AI, in a buy versus build context. Is it even possible to try to build this internally, you think, or is this something which always would go to the buy side of things?
That's an interesting one. I think the cost of certain technology is coming down in general. So
Mhm.
maybe where you might have historically built it because you thought you could build it cheaper, that may no longer be an argument. You may be able to buy something just because over time it's not as costly as it used to be. And you may now have the skill set where before maybe the large language model a decade ago, most people wouldn't be able to do themselves. But now there's certain tools and prepackaged things that maybe you could start with that weren't available in the past. That one's a sticky one because there's still a lot of security concerns or nervousness, I would say, at least in my organization. And I think also, although it sounds very exciting, the value case, I think, for a lot hasn't yet been totally proved out. So I don't know that, although I'm super excited and I want to do all these fun things, I don't know that I'm going to get to do them quite so quickly as I would prefer. And normally that is going to rise to the level of technical skill set where it's going to be out of my hands.
Yeah. Yeah. So you already touched upon security issues or the fact that it can be completely novel and scary or threatening even to organizations. But what about the aspect of the fact that you might be reinventing the wheel, which is available on the shelf outside, and you try to reinvent it internally with then maybe quite some waste of time and energy and money on wheels that are available outside? What's your view on that? When does it make sense to try to reinvent the wheel yourself?
No, but market analysis is definitely going to play into it. So even in my France example, we went out and we asked our advisors, you can ask peers. I definitely always keep my network up and running so I can ask station, what have you guys done? Did that work well when you bought it? I've heard stories where maybe they bought something off the shelf and they used it for a year or two and then they walked away from it. And that's very telling. So if I tap someone on the shoulder and ask them a question and that's the answer, I'm really going to have pause whether or not that particular application software vendor or whatever makes sense for us. I think leveraging other folks' lessons learned is very helpful, right? Asking questions on how they designed things, what they did, what worked well, what didn't work well, best practices. I make sure that my network, I have peers, I have consultants, I have vendors, and I can ask all of them questions to make sure that whatever we're looking at is a really good fit.
Yeah. So you would actively try to get in contact with users of a specific product, even if you don't know them, if they are outside of your network, and you would try to, yeah, get connected with them and hear their firsthand experiences, right?
So even within a large proposal, say even if it's building or buying, we may ask for references and we often try and push for a reference for another organization that is our same industry, preferably, and even like size and footprint, so that we know that it's a proven product for a use case such as ours.
Yeah. You are now, Sarah, you are in a very large multinational, but try to put yourself in the shoes of a mid-core say 100 legal entities active globally, but maybe in 25 countries, a tax team of 3 or 5, a finance organization of maybe 50 people. How would you, based on your current experience coming from a Fortune 500, how would your buy versus build analysis be different when you are in a mid-corp, in a much smaller organization? What are the typical things that come to mind when you would try to put yourself in the shoes of a tax manager, tax technology manager, even in a smaller organization?
I think both sized organizations probably have budget constraints, right?
Mhm.
I think maybe if I was at a smaller organization, and this could be a fallacy, but looking at the resources that I have and the skill set, I'm just assuming they have less people, right? I think that could really play into whether or not you have the bandwidth to build something. And you may always kind of be looking to see more of what's off the shelf, what ease of implementation do I have? But I don't want to count them out, right? Because we have found a lot of success in the citizen development stack. And I think sometimes it's looking for and finding folks that maybe you wouldn't have originally thought of. We've had some engineers out of our plants that have built amazing solutions out of our citizen development stack. There may be resources and skills in folks that you would not traditionally um, be aware of.
Yeah, that's indeed interesting. If you can have them available for you, that's definitely
We've done small innovation challenges
mhm.
and we've done hackathons, which I think help give people the opportunity and maybe the free space to show their curiosity and potentially their aptitude. And you may find some hidden diamonds, if that makes sense, in your organization that you weren't aware of.
Can you, for the audience, give an example of or explain a bit the concept of a hackathon and give an example of one you did in the tax context?
Sure. So a hackathon is usually a couple days. I guess you could space it out, but it's finding a problem and dedicating the time and the space and your resources to working together collaboratively in an iterative fashion and agile fashion. You're going to fail. And that's what we expect. But then you pivot and you keep going. And at the end, you're trying to solve whatever that business problem was or and seeing whatever that outcome you were looking for was. And I like the concept of it because it normally lets people focus because oftentimes if you ask someone to work on something that maybe is outside their day job or is in addition to, they're very distracted and it's hard to stop doing whatever they're needing to get done and work on this special project. So this kind of gives you a captive audience, if that makes sense. And then you're all in there working together to achieve something. Normally you're not going to find or not end with this perfect production ready polished product. But what you're aiming for is that minimal viable product of what can I get to quickly that solves my problem. And then maybe we can enhance it and develop it further and get it ready for prime time and production ready. We have spent time with some partners, so we don't necessarily always do them alone, where we'll go through and say, here's all the things that are causing us pain right now. Here are the different business outcomes we're trying to achieve. This is how we're trying to push our maturity curves to the right. Here are all of our use cases or ideas. And then we'll spend time together and evaluate them and see which ones make sense. Which one do we own the process fully, or we can get to the data, or we think that the potential solution is something that's citizen development that we can do. And then we'll isolate those use cases and set time and work on them together. I really enjoy them because it also lets people see the art of possible and it lets them maybe flex that muscle or skill set or that professional curiosity they don't get on a daily basis, but really upskills your team from both a design, development, technical perspective, but it's shifting that mindset too. Let's think about process. Let's think about the best ways of working and then what, technology can we layer on top of it in order to achieve it.
That's very interesting. And I guess definitely something to try by everybody. You can even probably do it in a virtual context and just make sure that you have a diverse set of brains in the room and do the brainstorming around potential solutions and live with the fact that potentially there is only a half-baked solution that will come out of it, but that's more than enough, right? And potentially there is a serendipity effect also into it, which brings you to magic solutions.
Like you didn't even, something you had never thought about. We definitely end up pivoting a lot in the hackathon. So I just want to make sure people realize that's the whole point of that, right? Like it's for innovation, it's for failing fast, it's for failing forward. That's the whole point of a hackathon or an innovation challenge for sure.
All right, all right. We're nearing the end of the conversation, Sarah. So if you would summarize the most important aspects in the buy versus build analysis that everybody needs to take home, what would you say, top of mind? What are the key takeaways in the buy versus build analysis that our audience should take home?
It's definitely budget's going to be at the top. Resources, skill set. I think speed and performance are always something to think about. I don't know. Trying to see. I actually had, and I know you're probably going to have to edit this, something up that I was looking at. The support model is very critical. The roadmap enhancement model is very critical. I think risk, process, and data are always going to be things that you're going to consider no matter what you do.
I like that. And I cannot stress more to the audience my big love to process excellence in general. And you did drive home that point already in the beginning of the conversation, but I like the fact that you repeat it here as well. Like it's such a crucial part of every analysis. And yeah, to your point, if the process is broken, you can try whatever technology to fix it, but it won't fix it. It first needs to have improvement of the process before technology can then make it more efficient and automated and whatnot. No, very clear. Finally, what would be your biggest recommendation or piece of advice that you have in general for our in-house tax audience? Something you want to share based on the career you've had so far, the experience you've had so far, the biggest piece of advice you want to give?
I would say have courage to fail. I know that's hard and it goes against what a lot of our professional natures are. But I think, especially in this space, it's bringing ideas, it's networking, it's talking to other folks, it's leveraging those lessons learned and identifying those accelerators, and then being okay to come and bring your idea and really advocate for yourself. I'm very biased because this is the area I work in, but I do feel like it's the way of the future for tax departments. But it also is an unsung hero because everyone just thinks of the normal compliance and provision and whatever work. But I think that it's going to become more and more important and for those folks to be able to do what they do effectively and to have that tax technology, that tax transformation process excellence included. And so I think it's advocating for yourself and helping to show leadership in others how much value it brings so that they can also help you along that journey.
Right. Sounds very aligned to indeed what I would expect also to drive value. So thanks for sharing that, Sarah. Thanks for the very thoughtful conversation in general. And I hope to see you anytime soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Stevie.